Good evening, everyone. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this essay called It's actually a book called Border of Ecologies. I'm just focusing mainly on the introduction, which is quite long, but I thought it was interesting because it shows how far academic articles go. It's not the same as some of the articles we've read in the past. It's similar somewhat to A Very Bordered World, but I realized that this is a sort of unique approach because so far we've been talking about border studies in terms of its physical borders and in terms of its social borders, right? But what about studies in between or adding other ideas? And in this case, this essay mixes border studies with social boundaries and mixes it with what we call ecology studies or thinking about the environment. And the subject matter is very current. A lot of people in America are unaware of what's kind of going on in China and in Hong Kong. There's a lot of debate right now as to whether or not China should have more control, and that Hong Kong should have more autonomy over its own land. And it's very interesting that I've already read a book on this called Landscapes Lost and Found, as you can see here. And it's a rather short book, but it kind of introduced me to the sort of ecological landscapes that make Hong Kong unique. And so, one of the things that this author does in this book here is he offers that certain things should be considered ecological and part of Hong Kong's identity. We in America have something similar in which we say certain national parks, for example, cannot be built on. You can't build a whole bunch of condos there because it's not allowed, right? So this sort of idea of a border ecology is very interesting to me because it talks about the environment as well as talking about physical and social borders that exist as a result of it, right? So it's highly political. And in Hong Kong, there's a sort of real fear over losing all of the ecology that makes Hong Kong very unique. Despite what many people may think, China and Hong Kong, generally so, not completely obviously, but generally so, has a lot of open land, more than you would think anyway. And it's very interesting how much greenery they have. And so, partially, a lot of what these authors are trying to say is that people should keep these as it has a lot of ecological impact. If you ever get the chance to go to China or Hong Kong, you'll see a lot of unique birds and a lot of unique marshes and lands that you probably won't see in other places. So it's very interesting to talk about this topic. And again, when we're talking about a border ecology, much like border studies, it is highly political. And so this very first outgoing paragraph here says it all. Hong Kong's border with Shenzhen is incrementally dissolving, and he talks about why that is. So, for example, in China is a very big country, right? Beijing's towards the top. You got Shanghai in the east, but down south is something called Shenzhen, and Shenzhen is the border between Hong Kong and China. And it's very interesting to a lot of people who may have been there or people who exist there. Um, there's these things called special administrative regions. So China said, okay, well, you know what? We're going to allow these countries to be their own countries, have their own policies and everything, but the big but, they will eventually be a part of us. So Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Macau, those are the three special administrative regions. Macau is an island by itself, which has a lot of influence from Portugal. Taiwan has a lot of influence from China and Japan because of World War II and because of the Cultural Revolution in China. There's a lot of history there. The people that were capitalists had to move to Taiwan. So basically, it's like seeing Taiwan. Taiwan is like seeing an alternate version of China. And then lastly, Hong Kong, which was at that time taken over first by the British, then taken over by the Japanese, and then given back to the British with a little bit of Chinese influence. And then there was the big, what we call handover, which happened with Bill Clinton and um, the British Queen, in which they gave over Hong Kong to China by 2047. So it's a little bit confusing, though. So this history is a little bit confusing because in 1997, what essentially happened is Britain said, "Okay, we colonized them. We are leaving this country." So they completely left, but they said, "Let Hong Kong have its own government until 2047. Then you can merge it with China." So there's this sort of agreement, which is why this first paragraph is so important. Hong Kong's border with Shenzhen is incrementally, that means slowly dissolving. It's going away. By 2047, which is supposed to be the year that the border will no longer exist, right, between the two countries, it's supposed to go into China. It will no longer be considered a special administrative region. This will mean the conjoining or adding of the economic, political, and social systems that have so far been able to operate separately. And this is an actual policy that they came up with. And I've always found this very ironic. One country, two systems. So let's break that down. One country means Hong Kong and China are two separate countries, but they're going to act as one, right? If one is under attack, the other one helps it. Two systems. We got communism and you have capitalism. You kind of merge the two together in some very odd ways. Um, that's why they call it the two systems policy. Unfortunately, and actually very interestingly enough, economically, they blend the two together, right? It's only natural that they eventually blend the two together. So you see a little bit of communism while also seeing capitalism at the same time. It's a very unique situation, which also makes this such a interesting little article, right? So again, in 2047, Hong Kong is supposed to become fully integrated into mainland China, or will it? Question. Why is that important? Why did they question that right there? Because what they're trying to say is that the uncertainty surrounding what will happen has created huge anxiety, and the authors seem to argue or believe that Hong Kong will remain autonomous. And partially the reasons for this relates to the economy, which he kind of brings out a little bit further later on in this book, but also socially, right? There's a lot of people. I've been to Hong Kong and China. It's very interesting to see people who live in China come to Hong Kong, but they don't speak what we call Cantonese, which is the language that they use in Hong Kong. And so people from the mainland often cannot talk to people from Hong Kong unless they speak English, or vice versa. The people from Hong Kong have to speak Mandarin, which is something that is now slowly becoming a part of their culture. So it's a very interesting sort of unique boundary, right? Social boundaries, social policies have completely shifted these sort of borders, right? And it's very interesting to see that many people who are from Hong Kong, otherwise known as Cantonese people, do not associate themselves with China. And people from China do not associate themselves with the Cantonese. So there's this sort of disconnect, right? Which is very interesting. So caught within this debate is, and now they're kind of bringing it, they're launching in their article and making it more specific. Caught within this debate is the frontier closed area. And here's the border, right? This is the fiscal border. A buffer zone created by the British in 1951 to strengthen Hong Kong's separation or independence from China. Now it's starting to slowly change, and I really like this group of photos here. It's perfect. They even put a line and put SC which stands for Shenzhen, which is the mainland China, and HK, which stands for Hong Kong. And he shows a deliberate, very contrasted image, right? This is a 180-degree image. And if you look here, you see huge buildings, freeways, lots of infrastructure, right? Wow, that's incredible. But now let's scroll down and look over here. What do you see? You see grass, overgrown grass, and a lot of nature, right? So there's a huge contrast between the two, right? And this is going to be his sort of themed idea here. In 2016, the frontier closed area has almost been erased, and with it over 2,000 hectares of land. So there's the ecology part, right? Hectares are huge amounts of land. We normally think of land in terms of acres, so hectares are even bigger than that. We're talking, this could be almost like its own city, right? This is huge. Have been opened up for future alternative uses. But as a result, and here's the sort of, he's making a sort of counter here, right? I'm adding in the word but. The shrinking of the border, and I'm using the fiscal border here instead of buffer zone, and consequent release of land is not simply a question of planning. In other words, they're doing something on purpose, right? He's explaining what it is that they're trying or attempting to do here. He talks about the history of what it was originally intended to do, but how it is completely changed. And why? In this case, he is going to make an argument that the frontier closed border should be considered a border ecology. And he defines it here as very important, right? Because this is actually his thesis. The border ecology is defined as an interwoven set of relationships that emerge as a result of the differences between Hong Kong and mainland China. So it's not just about the physical differences, it's also about the social, political, ecological differences between the two, right? And here is the thesis of the book. And again, depending on how long an essay is, or depending on how long a book is, oftentimes this determines how long your thesis will be. In this case, it's pretty much a paragraph, right? It's a paragraph. So this book explores the unique border ecology of this physical border between Shenzhen and Hong Kong by describing specific narratives and their spatial effects. And by spatial effects, we're talking about the differences in space, right? The differences in space that have evolved over time. Again, just like the US-Mexico border wall, it's not just how it has changed physically, but also how it is changed by its ideological meaning, right? And he kind of is saying the same thing here. By unpeeling the layers of this uncharted territory, the authors reveal a complex set of relationships that operate between macro policies and micro conditions on the ground. So macro, and we use this oftentimes in social sciences. A good example is macroeconomics versus microeconomics. So macroeconomics and macro policies are large national and countrywide policies, or even global policies, right? It's the bigger picture, much bigger picture. So if you've ever heard the word macroeconomics, they're not just talking about someone's bank account. They're talking like a nation, or even uh, a whole continent's sort of economics. And micro conditions, micro meaning small, right? Very microscopic. We use this all the time in the physical and biological sciences. So micro conditions, the small conditions that are affected by the larger policies, right? In other words, there's this sort of interesting connection between the bigger and larger countrywide policies and the sort of smaller conditions that are affected by it in that physical space that are emblematic, and I'm going to use the word emblematic, or they symbolize the sort of differences within the two cultures. This introductory article describes the broader, and here it is, political, historical, and environmental context of the frontier closed area, defining how this context can be framed conceptually as a border ecology, and outlines a strategic approach to design, proposing insertions within this ecology, offering an alternate form of development that is open-ended to adjust to the uncertainty facing Hong Kong in 27 and beyond. So he's got these sort of 7 chapters laid out, right? These are the sort of 7 main ideas that are going to be talked about in this book. He's brought it out, right? Remember I talked about supporting reasons? This is exactly what we're talking about. He's got a lot of supporting reasons, but his main concept or his main purpose in writing this book, what makes it unique, what makes it special, is that they want to argue in this article that they want to make an alternate approach to the border ecology of Hong Kong's frontier closed area. So that's the sort of main idea. And then within that, there are a lot of different topics that are very important, right? So in writing a paper, in essay 1, I asked you to write 3 main ideas. In essay 2, I asked you to write at least 4. You can expect to almost write at least 8 to 10 body paragraphs, maybe more, in a 6 to 8 page paper, right? And a 7 to 10 page paper or 8 to 10 page paper, you just keep building, right? It's a building block. You just keep going. You did it once, you did it twice. Now the third time you got to do even more, right? This is why subparagraphing is so important. You're going to be limited with your main ideas. So what you need to do is you need to dig deeper into these sort of main ideas. And this is a great example of that. So this is part 1 of the video, and I'm going to continue with the next part.